Hello, this is Katie Starr, and thank you for joining me in this conversation about Cumberland Island National Seashore. In today's presentation, I'll be highlighting just a few of the ethical issues surrounding Georgia's largest barrier island. Before we get started, I want to give a brief history of Cumberland Island so we have more context in which we can place the ethical issues the island wilderness is facing today. Here we have the roughly laid out outline of the island starting about 4,000 years ago, but I'm mostly going to focus on the last 100 years. So, in 1880, Thomas and Lucy Carnegie of Carnegie Steel bought land on Cumberland Island for a winter retreat. Lucy built a 59-room Scottish castle on the site of the old Dignes remains, and she named her castle Dignes after Catherine Miller's mansion. Lucy later bought Stanfield Plantation, the name of the Miller's plantation, and built other mansions for her children around the island, and named them Grayfield and Plum Orchard. After Lucy's death, Dignes was left vacant and then burned down, assumed arson in 1959, and in the mid-1950s was the beginning of change for the island. In 1955, the National Park Service named Cumberland Island one of the most significant natural areas in the U.S., with environmental activism fueling many parts of the nation and pockets in Georgia. President Nixon signed into law former President Carter's proposed Cumberland Island National Seashore, turning the island into protected federal land. The Carnegie heirs still hold lifetime property rights. We'll address that in just a bit. Pictured here are the remains of the Carnegie nest today. And major laws that affect Cumberland Island are the Cumberland Island National Seashore, which was authorized by Congress in 1972. According to this law, all the lands and surrounding waters of the islands are to be administered by the National Park Service, and the Carnegie family still hold the majority of their property to the park, but retain lifetime rights to the island. This means they still live and work on the island, but the National Park Service is responsible for building and ground upkeep. In addition to the National Seashore, after years of advocacy, in 1982, the Cumberland Island Wilderness Act was passed by Congress, was designated over 9,000 acres of land to be made wilderness, with the following guidelines to add an additional 11,000 at a later date. In the time I had for this project, I couldn't find where that 11,000 was added to the island, or if it had already been incorporated. It was very vague. More research is needed there. So what are some of the ethical issues facing Cumberland Island Seashore, you ask? Well, I'm so glad you're interested. There were plenty I noticed once I started digging, but today I'll just focus on a select few and how they relate to the wilderness we just spoke of. The three main issues I see facing the island wilderness are so intertwined it's difficult to address one without the other. Feral animals, including wild hogs and the romantic wild horses, are not native to the island. They are malnourished and diseased, and they destroy the island's fragile ecosystems. In the case of the hogs, they forage and feast upon endangered sea turtle eggs, which brings up my next point of endangered species. Cumberland Island is home to more than 49 protected, even endangered species. Just to focus down for this project, I will addressing the 4 endangered sea turtles that nest on the 17 miles of Cumberland Island beaches, much of which is or was encompassed in the island wilderness and thus protected by the Wilderness Act of 1964. I say was, though, because my next point, the island's visitor limits and motorized tours, change this, and perhaps the most egregious affront to environmental ethics is found here. So let me break these down in a little bit. First, we have management. The hogs and horses on Cumberland Island were first introduced by the Spanish when they arrived. The men came and went, but the animals stayed. Today there are thousands of wild hogs and hundreds of wild horses roaming the island. Carol Ruckteschel, who we'll meet a little bit later, said, "Livestock compete for food and drastically modify the habitat, creating a stressed ecosystem for all native island species. Feral animals are a threat to the island's dune system by eating the sea oats and cordgrass that grow there. Without these grasses and their roots to provide structure for the dunes fall apart, resulting in one less level of protection for the island. Horses also eat the Spanish moss which hangs from the live oaks, and hogs disrupt other native plants in their foraging. Both are threats to the amphibians and birds and reptiles, as their hooves compact the soil and sand, crushing nests and eggs. Hogs will even sniff out endangered sea turtle nests and eat all of the eggs. Rectichel stated in her book, Natural History of Cumberland Island, "The island is large enough to have a variety of habitats, which tends to ameliorate extreme situations by offering options, and so reduces the potential for extinction. However, competition is so great from exotic feral livestock, horses and hogs on Cumberland Island, that other competitive relationships pale. Livestock compete for food and drastically modify the habitat, creating stressed ecosystems for all of the island's native species. The wild horses even cause damage to the archaeological sites and artifacts on the island. We'll touch on the historic homes of the island in just a bit, but I wanted to highlight the feral animal impact on these sites because it is important for the argument of animal management and land ethic later. So that's feral animals. We touched on the effects they had on the endangered species, so let's see what else is affecting the endangered species on the island. Cumberland Island's endangered and protected species are in the air, on land, and in water. North Atlantic right whales calve half a mile off Cumberland Island. Humpback whales pass through the offshore waters during their migration, and West Indian manatees have even been spotted. To try and stay focused for this project, I'll just be addressing the sea turtles that nest on the beaches. Cumberland Island National Seashore has the longest-running loggerhead turtle conservation project in the world. Loggerhead sea turtles, green sea turtles, leatherback sea turtles, and Cape Ridley sea turtles have all been recorded nesting on the island's beaches. I wanted to dedicate space to addressing this issue here because in addition to the threat from feral animals on the island, these sea turtles face numerous threats off island as well. Just off the coast of Cumberland Island, less than half a mile, approximately where the right whales calve, is also some of the U.S. best shrimping waters. Thousands of pounds of shrimp is brought in by trawling, but very little mention is given to bycatch. In the early 1980s, turtle extruder devices, or TEDs, were introduced, but research by Epley and Tees as late as 2002 showed that TEDs are too small for 33 to 47% of stranded loggerhead turtles and 1 to 7% of stranded green sea turtles. Not to mention that many TEDs are not being installed properly on shrimping vessels. The continued high mortality of sea turtles by trawling is cause for great concern. The way sea turtles nest, always returning to the same beaches, perhaps 20 to 30 years after hatching, means we need to be doing all we can to keep the beaches and surrounding waters clear for these turtles well into the future. Okay, back to the island. Since Cumberland Island has been made a national seashore, there have been more direct focus on how the island has been managed, with good reason. Since the National Park Service took control of the island, though, there have been numerous rifts between the Park Service and the families that still live on the island, which brings us to how the island should be used and how the land should be used, with a focus on Leopold's land ethic. There seems to be two main camps on Cumberland. The economic side, the island should be open to the public, there should be at least 1,000 people per day visiting the island, and motorized tours should run throughout the island using the main road, which cuts through the middle of the island, north to south, and on the beaches. Then there's the conservation side. 2/3 of the island is already federally protected wilderness. The island visitor limit should stay 300 people per day. There should be no motorized vehicles through the wilderness or on the beaches. Leopold saw similar camps in his time and place. He stated, "Recreation is commonly spoken of as an economic resource. It is also an ethical aspect. We seek contacts with nature because we derive pleasure from them. Cumberland Island is a beautiful island. Having visited the island myself once and camped in the wilderness area, I can attest to its recreational outlets." However, Leopold noted, even in 1949, that for his Wilderness Society, which later the Wilderness Act derived key principles from, there are issues such as roads and motorized recreation that needs to be addressed. Leopold Society seek to exclude roads from the hinterlands, and the Chamber of Commerce to extend them, both in the name of recreation. The same was being done at Cumberland Island. Remember when I said we'd get back to the mansions? Well, here we go. The Carnegie Mansions are a Grayfield, Plum Orchard, and Stanford plantation. Grayfield, Plum Orchard are the Carnegie family sold their properties to the National Park Service, but they still maintain lifetime rights to the property. Grayfield is owned by a Carnegie heir, but is now run as an upscale inn, with rooms start at $750 a night. Plumfield Orchard was gifted to the National Park Service before the lifetime rights were up, and Stamford is still privately owned. In 2004, it came to the public's attention that the National Park Service, in partnership with the Grayfield Inn, were running motorized vehicles and bus tours on the main road. Remember the main road that runs through the middle of the island, north to south, and on the beaches, both of which were categorized as a wilderness under the Cumberland Island Wilderness Act of 1982. Motorized tours running multiple times a day through the island wilderness. This led to a lawsuit against the National Park Service, found in the U.S. 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, Wilderness Watch Through versus Manila. The court decided in the favor of the Wilderness Watch. The Wilderness won. All motorized vehicle tours had to be stopped. Almost immediately, the Carnegie family appealed to their lifelong friend, Georgia Republican Congressman Jack Kingston. Kingston drafted a bill to adjust the boundary of the wilderness to not include the road or the beaches. There were protests, and the bill sat on the House calendar. The bill still is on the House calendar, but Cumberland Island Wilderness Boundary Adjustment Act of 2004 was passed into law. When Congressman Kingston slipped the bill into the 2005 appropriations bill. The public was not notified of this change until after the law was passed. This is a direct violation of the Wilderness Act of 1964. This is also the first, at least that I could find, where wilderness was taken away from the American public purely for economic tourist reasons. Now, more people drive on Cumberland Island National Seashore than any other island in Georgia, the most important beach for sea turtles and seabirds in the state, also has the most traffic. Part of the law passed in the Boundary Adjustment Act is not just declaring the main road and beaches are no longer part of the wilderness. You can now have vehicles on them. The law also requires that no more than 8 and no less than 5 tour buses drive through the wilderness per day. I personally feel that there's a lot of ethical issues just around this one thing, but to keep it wrapped for this project, how we decide to use the land is extremely important. Are we creating a recreational park, or are we trying to conserve one of the last wild islands in the United States? As per the Wilderness Act of 1964, I do not think Cumberland Island National Seashore meets the definition of wilderness anymore. How can we call 2/3 of this island wilderness when man has introduced hogs and horses which have turned feral and are now destroying the island's fragile ecosystems and feasting on endangered species? How is it still wilderness when bus tours are rolling through at least 5 times a day? And where is the voice for the island? How do endangered species who call this island home get agency in any of this? Animal management, land management, and care ethics all have a place in the story of Cumberland Island today. Carol Ruckteschel lives in Cumberland Island, although she is not a Carnegie heir or a National Park Ranger. Carol is a self-taught biologist, naturalist, and Cumberland Island environmental activist. She has lived on the island for more than 40 years. Before the National Park Service even took possession of it, she was there. She has spent the majority of her time studying the plants and animals on the island, particularly sea turtles, and advocating for their rights of existence. She was instrumental in creating the Cumberland Island Wilderness Act with President Carter, and from her work grew WildCumberland.org, an advocacy group dedicated to protecting the wilderness, native species, and ecology of Cumberland Island. In just the last few years, the ProtectCumberlandIsland.org advocacy group proposed a commercial spaceport to be built on mainland Georgia that would cause rockets to fly directly over the Cumberland Island National Seashore and Wilderness. Ruckteschel and these groups employ care ethics to advocate for animal and land management on the island. I found their work inspiring. I hope you do as well. Cumberland Island National Seashore and Wilderness is Georgia's largest barrier island. The island has centuries worth of history, human and natural. It is home to one of the nation's wealthiest families, numerous endangered species, and one self-taught sea turtle biologist. It is worth considering the ethical issues laid forth today to help conserve this national treasure for future generations. Thank you.